Good evening. Welcome once again to the Rose Drive Library in Morgan, Utah, here on a midsummer evening, 11th of August. Welcome to Gospelspeak. As we can see on the board, we're at session 95. This evening we'll be talking about the governing quorums of the church, or the leadership quorums of the church. I did want to just again mention, I've had over the past little while just a few comments about Gospelspeak from those that participate. Do want to remind everyone that what we do here for Gospelspeak is totally nonprofit, fully volunteer, and I appreciate the help of my boys Joshua and Sean in facilitating these discussions and helping with the technology and providing the capability to stream on YouTube and to have it recorded. Again, most of the it appears that most of the time people go back afterwards and look at it. But I just want to mention again, totally nonprofit, totally volunteer. So no one's making any money for this. We do it just to share our testimony and to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. So this evening here, our topic again, we're talking, and I called this All the President's Men because it has to do with the president of the church. And as we go through the discussion this evening, we'll talk about that principle that's known as succession in the presidency. And one of the reasons for that is we've had some of our earlier discussions here in Gospelspeak. We know that with the restoration, with the beginning of the revelations that Joseph received, and those in the early days, back in the late 1820s and the 1830s, we had some discussions. In fact, there was one that we did called the Oracles of God. And in that case, we recognized that as all this movement was underway, a lot of excitement, a lot of people, a lot of spiritual manifestations, those individuals that were involved wanted to participate in a lot of that. And so there were a number of instances that we've discussed previously where individuals would say, oh, by the way, yes, Joseph received some revelation from the church, and he received this, and he translated the Book of Mormon. Oliver Cowdery was interested in doing translation of the plates. There were many that claimed to have visions on behalf of the church, and we know there's several revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants that indicate and point out that Joseph was, in essence, the prophet. He was the president. At the time, it wasn't necessarily referred to as a president, but he was the leader of this organization on behalf of the Lord Jesus Christ. And one thing we recognize, and as we go through our discussion this evening, we'll see that this is not the church of Joseph Smith. This is the church of Jesus Christ. Joseph was the ordained prophet of the restoration. And I have a great love and affection and appreciation for everything that Joseph did. Unfortunately, there were members of his families and others that were of the mindset, well, Joseph started all this, and he went through all this suffering and all this that occurred in order to bring about this organization. So as we'll see, at the time of his death, and we'll talk a little bit about the martyrdom this evening, but our emphasis will be on the structure of the governing quorums and the way we can see now that the Lord prepared the church for the eventuality that Joseph would no longer be there. And as we have gone on now, over time, over that course of that 200 plus years, we see that transition has happened many times. And how does that occur? That's what we'll talk this evening as we go through our discussion. So Joshua, if we can go to the slides. Okay, I need my PowerPoint. Okay. So, as we've talked before, we've had a number of discussions on the priesthood, and we'll not talk too much this evening about the restoration specifically of the priesthood, but I just wanted to summarize a couple of things here. In the spring of 1829, we recall the visit of John the Baptist. We've had many discussions about John the Baptist. That was the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood, or as we talked in our previous session, the lesser priesthood, dealing with temple ordinances. Shortly thereafter, a few weeks after that, visit of Peter, James, and John, and the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood. Now that Melchizedek priesthood, we understand, was absolutely necessary to organize a church on the earth, to restore the church of Jesus Christ. So here we see, recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants in section 20, Joseph Smith Jr., who was called of God and ordained an apostle of Jesus Christ to be the first elder of this church. So there, and not surprising, Joseph was the prophet. What's important here is now this specific reference to the fact that he was ordained as an apostle. In fact, the first apostle ordained in the last days under the hands of Peter, James, and John. And as we've had previous discussions, we have gone back and traced that lineage and recognized that Peter, as the senior apostle, was the one who had the right to confer that apostleship on Joseph Smith. Along with Joseph Smith, at the same time, again, we know of Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery, here in verse 3, who was also called of God as an apostle of Jesus Christ to be the second elder of this church. So here now, we're beginning to see some precedence, some seniority established. Joseph as the first, Oliver as the second. So Joseph was the first ordained apostle, senior apostle. Oliver was the second. And then we know the story of the three witnesses. We've gone through that discussion before. I just want to point out here in section 18, verse 9, in Revelation to Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer at the time, Oliver Cowdery, this is the Lord speaking to them. I speak unto you, and also unto David Whitmer, even as unto Paul mine apostle. And then pay attention, for you are called even with that same calling with which he was called. So here we have an indication in section 20, and by indication here of the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood, we already recognize that Oliver Cowdery was an ordained apostle. Here, this gives us an indication that David Whitmer now specifically is called out as one having that calling as an apostle. And we know, as we'll talk about later on in 1835, that Martin Harris also had that calling, because it became the duty of these three witnesses now after Zion's camp to point out, to call, and to set apart the original quorum of the 12 apostles. So even though these three individuals, Oliver, David, and Martin, had been ordained to that office in the Melchizedek priesthood as apostles, they never were members of the quorum of the 12 apostles. They were ordained apostles in that order, but they were not members of the quorum. So we can see Joseph, Oliver, David, and Martin, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in seniority as far as being ordained apostles. And then later on, here we'll talk about the organization of the quorum of the 12 apostles. So as we go on, now we will talk about the First Presidency. So what we see as this new church is coming into existence, as we mentioned before, there's so much doctrine, so much principle. What we talk this evening is in relation to the governing quorums of the church. Now, we understand that Joseph was not, no person would have been in any position to receive all of this at one time, or even within the course of 1 or 2 weeks or 1 or 2 months. So this came gradually, line upon line, precept upon precept, as we are told in section 93, until the fullness was restored. So it took some time to have this fullness restored. When the church started out with 6 members and then had a few hundred and went on into the area of Kirtland, Ohio, there were, again, a few hundred less than 1,000. There was really no need to have a First Presidency. But as the movement began to grow and increase in membership now, we're into section 81 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Now in around 1832, 1833, it became necessary. Of course, the Lord knew this needed to happen at some point. But here now we're beginning to get indications about the establishment of what we call and what will be referenced as the First Presidency. Here in section 81, verses 1 and 2, is a reference to Joseph Smith. And here the Lord says, this Joseph, unto whom I have given the keys of the kingdom. Now the keys of the kingdom, we've talked about that as well, the keys of the priesthood, in order to manage and control the work that is going on. And now he says the keys of the kingdom, which belong always unto the presidency of the high priesthood. In our last session we talked about the high priesthood. Here now we're talking about a presidency. Why do we need a president? Well, there has to be some organization in place to govern the church and to maintain order in the church. So we can see again, as I mentioned earlier this evening, when Joseph began to receive revelations, and there were many others professing to have received revelation, it was necessary for revelation to come to the prophet and tell those other individuals, you are not authorized, that is not your calling. There's one individual, and that is Joseph. And here the Lord reaffirms, I have given the keys of the kingdom. So now it became necessary to establish a First Presidency. Here we read in section 90 verses, and this is across, I just picked out some points here from verses 6, 19, and 21, where the Lord points out specifically, Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams are accounted as equal with thee in holding the keys of this last kingdom. In essence, this is now in section 90 where the Lord establishes counselors for the prophet Joseph Smith. On the 18th of March then in 1833, then this First Presidency was organized. and came into being as the leading, as we'll see in just a moment in section 107, as the leading quorum of the church. However, keep in mind, where Joseph was an ordained apostle, neither Sidney nor Frederick were ever ordained apostles. They were called as counselors. So we know throughout the history, the 200-year history of the church, that as a First Presidency has been organized, generally, and as we see today, primarily the counselors in the First Presidency primarily have always been ordained apostles. Today they are ordained apostles. However, there have been some situations, and that's okay, as long as they're high priests, they can act as counselors in the First Presidency. So this was the case with Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams. In addition now, this is key to remember right here, what about Oliver Cowdery? He was right there with Joseph. Well, now, here we see in 1834, recorded in the Documentary History of the Church, Volume 2, page 176, Joseph makes the following statement. According to the direction of the Holy Spirit, on the 5th of December in 1834, I, meaning Joseph, laid my hands on Brother Oliver Cowdery and ordained him an assistant president to the high and holy priesthood in the Church of the Latter-day Saints. And what we'll find out, this position of assistant president is not extant in the church today. This is a very specific, unique calling that was necessary in order to bring forth the work at the time. And so Oliver, and by his right as the second apostle in seniority, was now ordained as the assistant president, in essence working in concert with Joseph in that leading quorum. He was not necessarily a part of the quorum, but he was designated as an assistant president. So we need to keep that in mind as we go forward and see how, again, this structure, and as I look at this and understand how all this fits together, I'm just constantly impressed. Of course, the Lord knows what's going on. And so we can see time and time and time again how he established these quorums and the leadership in the church to perpetuate the work of the kingdom, even as one prophet and the next were martyred, were shot, or whatever the case might be. I don't want to get too emotional tonight. So anyway, here we go. Now, now we're into section 107, where in this great revelation on the priesthood, we've talked some about this before. In the opening verses of section 107 is where we learn that within the church there are two priesthoods, namely the Melchizedek and the Aaronic priesthood. The Melchizedek being the holy priesthood after the order of the Son of God. And we've talked many times about that. In our last session we talked about the reference to this Melchizedek priesthood as the high priesthood, which it is. And then along with that there's the Aaronic priesthood, which now is in preparation for the Melchizedek priesthood. So here in section 107, verse 22, of this Melchizedek priesthood, 3 presiding high priests. So in order to be an apostle and the prophet, then of course it's necessary to be a high priest first. Chosen by the body, appointed and ordained to that office, and upheld by the confidence, faith, and prayer of the church, these 3 individuals form a quorum of the presidency of the church. So here in section 107, the indication, I now have this presiding quorum, which is the quorum of the First Presidency. We will say that originally there were there's always been at least 3 members in the First Presidency. On occasion, there have been additional counselors that have been called over time throughout the years. But the key point here is there are 3 that form the quorum of the presidency of the church. Then we go down after verse 22 and we go into verse 23, 24, and 33. Now we begin to talk about the 12 apostles, or special witnesses of the name of Christ in all the world. So now this is where the original quorum of the 12 apostles was established in February of 1835. So here now the Lord is saying, now I have the 12 apostles, special witnesses of the name of Christ. Here he says they form a quorum equal in authority and power to the 3 presidents previously mentioned. So sometimes we look at that and say, well, why would it be necessary that they have to be equal in authority and power to the quorum of the First Presidency. However, then he says, even though they're equal in authority and power to the three presidents previously mentioned to officiate in the name of the Lord, then he says in verse 33, under the direction of the presidency of the church. So even though they have the same power and authority as a quorum, together existing as a quorum, they now perform their duties under the direction of the presidency of the church. Then we go on and we see now this third quorum, the 70, are also called to preach the gospel as special witnesses. They form a quorum equal in authority to that of the 12 apostles to act in the name of the Lord under the direction of the 12. So here we see now, finally, we get to this point, 1835, and the Lord now is establishing the leading quorums of the church. So Joshua, if we go to the board, let me just, I want to draw just a quick picture up here to see how these relate to each other. So here we see in section 107, we've talked about, I have this quorum of the First Presidency. So this is my first presidency. That is the presiding, this is the presiding leading quorum of the church. Now, because the Lord is, he's pretty smart, he knows what's going to happen here and things that go forward, he cannot leave that just to these members of the First Presidency. So then he established now a quorum of the 12. And those that have been in the church, now we know that we have a First Presidency, we have a quorum of the 12. So what he says in section 107, that these in essence are equal in power and authority. However, direction comes from the First Presidency to the quorum of the 12. So what that means is if there's an issue with the First Presidency and they are not available because the quorum as a quorum, and in order to establish and function as a quorum, it's necessary to have at least 7 members of that quorum. At least 7, that's a majority, and that's also contained in section 107. At least 7 form a quorum. That's the majority that's necessary for them to function as a quorum. And then under that, we have this larger body of men. This is now the quorum of the 70, which was being established again at this time. So the quorum of the 70, we are told, they are equal in authority to the quorum of the 12. What does that mean? If the First Presidency quorum and the quorum of the 12, something happened and there was no leadership, then that leadership responsibility would devolve onto the quorum of the 70. But again, as long as the quorum of the 12 is in existence, then the 70 act under direction of the quorum of the 12. So we see there's order in the kingdom. There's a structure. There's also a provision. If something were to happen here, the church is not at a loss. And as we talk later this evening, we'll see that that's exactly what happened at the time of the martyrdom. Because the church was accustomed now, here I have Joseph. And the church was accustomed, I have Joseph. And what do I do if I don't have Joseph anymore? In fact, the Mobocrats, and one of the reasons for the martyrdom was people thought, if I get rid of Joe Smith and his brother Hiram, then this whole thing will fall apart. Before that happened, however, we see in section 107, the Lord established this line of communication, this line of order, this line of priesthood authority between the First Presidency, the quorum of the 12, and the quorum of the 70.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Question.
What's the difference between a special witness and an e-special witness?
It's in the language. E-special witness means that they, as prophets, seers, and revelators now, an e-special witness would have a particular calling by the Spirit to testify of Jesus Christ in a manner where often we will go to those that participate in the conference sessions. Many times you will hear one of the apostles or the president of the church make the statement that he is giving his apostolic blessing to the church. So e-special is a little bit more special than special. So the special witnesses as the 70, they have a calling to go out, but the e-special, that's like a grade, I think it's just indicating again that's the grade above the quorum of the 70. They have this and they can function in all this capacity, but now as e-special they have an added capacity.
Well, it says the 70 is the e-special.
The 70 is the special?
The 70 are also
Okay.
called to preach the gospel and to be special witness.
The special and special. Okay. Well, then I guess it's backwards from what I just said. So the apostle is special. The 70, whatever the language, the apostles will have an added measure of what the 70 can do. I guess that's the only explanation I could give in that regard. But there is a distinction between their calling and what they're capable of doing as an apostle or as a 70.
Well, I thought a special witness was someone who was.
What's that?
I thought a special witness was someone who was supposed to testify of Jesus Christ because they have a knowledge of Jesus Christ, and that's what makes them a special witness.
Yeah, certainly, and that's always a challenging question to say who might have more knowledge of Jesus Christ, and if we talk about knowledge, to what extent. We recall Elder McConkie as a member of the 12 on the last conference address he gave before he passed away. I think many remember that situation. When he indicated, he testified of Jesus Christ, and he said he recognized he was soon to pass on. And he said that within the next little while that he would be able to see the Savior. And he made the statement, he says, "But when I do, I will not know any more then than I know now that he lives." So how did he gain that knowledge? Through study, through guidance, through inspiration. And yeah, certainly the Quorum of the 12 are in that position now to basically their calling, as stated in section 107, was to carry the gospel to the world. Well, they can't do that on their own. That's why we have the 70 and then the other structures and organizations to do that. As to how does someone come to knowledge? Could someone have that same knowledge that did Elder McConkie ever see the Savior? He never professed that he did, but I think he indicated that he had not seen the Savior, but through his study and prayer and the Spirit testifying to him, he had a sure knowledge that Jesus Christ was the Savior. Can we have that? I would tend to think no one is precluded from having that. Okay, so we have those quorums now within that precedence, within that order. First Presidency, generally 3 members. In today and primarily over time, that the counselors here, as I mentioned before, had been ordained apostles. These are ordained apostles. The Quorum of the 70 are not. So if we go back to the PowerPoint, and I think for that question, I'm going to have to go back and do a bit more study and research to come up with a better answer on the distinction between being special or special witness.
Sean said, President Hinckley said the difference was just the E.
Just the E?
Yeah.
That may well be the case.
Some missionaries had a question for him about it, and he said just the E.
The E. Okay, that's a good answer.
Sean.
Thank you, Sean. I like that answer. Okay. So now we're in 1835. This is the time, February 1835, for the establishment of the first, or the original in the last days, at the time of the Restoration, Quorum of the 12 Apostles. So here in 1835, again, we had the First Presidency. At the time, Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Frederick G. Williams. We also had Oliver Cowdery as the assistant president of the church, as we looked earlier. And then we will see, we now had, as the president of this newly formed Quorum of the 12, Thomas B. Marsh as the senior apostle. In 1841, some changes had occurred. Frederick G. Williams had gone through some disarray, some disagreement, had fallen out of favor, had been disfellowshipped, although he never was excommunicated and never did leave the church, but he was in full fellowship when he died in 1842. In 1841, now this is section 124, First Presidency, Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and now William Law is the second counselor in the First Presidency. Oliver Cowdery had fallen away from the church and had in fact been excommunicated by this time. In section 100, actually the reference there is not correct, section 124, whereby he, meaning Hiram, may ask and receive and be crowned with the same blessing, glory, honor, and priesthood and gifts of the priesthood that once were put upon him that was my servant Oliver Cowdery. So this is key to understand. At this time, February 1835, and this is actually, apologize, it's not section 107, it's section 124. At that time, it's indicated that Hiram now, the brother of the prophet, was given that designation as the second apostle. So now we see Joseph is the first. Oliver had been excommunicated. That position was taken by Hiram. So Hiram now was the second in seniority in the apostleship because he received that blessing under the hand of Joseph. And then by this time, here on my PowerPoint, by this time Thomas B. Marsh also had apostatized and left the church. And we will see very specific direct statement here in section 124. If we open up to section 124 in the Doctrine and Covenants, this is key to understand. Now, at this time, in 1841, so within that course of 5 years, and we will see in the early days and early history of the church that there was a lot of churn, a lot of consternation, a lot of people coming in, leaving, apostatizing, turning against Joseph, a lot of difficulty, because obviously Lucifer was intent to do everything he could to destroy this new organization. Here in section 124, verse 127, I give unto you my servant Brigham Young to be a president over the 12 traveling council. So anything else that we might say in relation to that, this now is the definitive statement from the Lord, where in verses 125 and 126 he talks about Joseph, Sidney Rigdon, and then he says William Law. And these three now constitute that First Presidency in 1841. This was, again, a revelation to the prophet Joseph Smith in January of 1841. This is somewhat 6 years after the organization of the original Quorum of the 12. So now, Brigham Young, absolutely designated, no question, as the senior member of the Quorum of the 12. And then he goes on to list there after that the members of the Quorum of the 12, Heber C. Kimball, Parley Pratt, Orson Pratt, and so forth. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in just a moment. So what we see now, this is important to understand, 1841, this is 3 years prior to the martyrdom, 3.5 years before the martyrdom. So there's been a realignment in the Quorum. A lot of it because of apostasy, excommunication, people, men leaving their positions, turning against the prophet Joseph. So in 1841, this is where we are. This is the structure of the leading quorums of the church. So let me back up now and talk about the original Quorum of the 12 Apostles. So this quorum was organized on the 14th of February, 1835. So you see there the 12 individuals: Thomas B. Marsh, David W. Patton, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Orson Hyde, William E. McClellan, Parley P. Pratt, Luke Johnson, William Smith, Orson Pratt, John F. Boynton, and Lyman Johnson. Those are the original 12. That's recorded in the history of the documented history of the church. Now, at that time, there was a need to establish seniority. So Joseph said, right now, for this first organization, we will sit in seniority by age. And so as it turned out, Thomas B. Marsh was the oldest, David W. Patton was second oldest, Brigham Young was third. Even though by time of ordination, Thomas B. Marsh was the last one that was ordained as the apostle. However, because there was no precedent of seniority or anything else, Joseph determined that they would be seated by age. By ordination, then, Lyman E. Johnson, who was the youngest, was actually ordained first to the apostleship. Over that intervening time between 1835 and 1841, again, a lot of difficulty self-imposed within the church. And by that time in 1841, Thomas B. Marsh had apostatized and left the church. Lyman Johnson, the first ordained, had been excommunicated as well. Several others in there that had followed the same course. We won't talk about those in particular this evening. David W. Patton was killed at the Battle of Crooked River. And so we see, whether by age or by ordination, sequence of ordination, Brigham Young, if we follow the seating by age, Brigham Young was the senior member. If we follow the seating by ordination, Brigham Young, this is in 1841, was still the senior member of the quorum. Now, after 1841, predominantly the seating in the quorum was by date and time of ordination. There were some exceptions. We'll talk about that here again this evening briefly. There were some exceptions, but as far as this original quorum that we see here, now we understand Brigham Young, whether we did a seating by age or by time of ordination, Brigham Young was the senior apostle in 1841. If we go forward now to Carthage, June of 1844, at the time of the martyrdom. At that time, Joseph was still senior apostle by seniority. The first, as we saw back in section 20, the first elder, the first apostle of the church. Hiram now was second in seniority, having received the blessing that once was given to Oliver. Oliver's blessing recorded in section 20, that was given to Hiram as recorded in section 124. So we have Joseph and Hiram, ordained apostles. Joseph first, Hiram second. Within the First Presidency at the time of the martyrdom, if there were claimants, which there were many, and we'll talk about that briefly, there were many claimants to the leadership of the church. All of these individuals who were counselors to Joseph, none of them were ordained apostles. So if we're looking at the leadership belonging to anyone who has been an ordained apostle, none of these would have been in that position. Of course, at the time, the membership of the church being new, they had never gone through this experience before. And I'm quite certain there was not this understanding about the necessity of this lineage by seniority of time of ordination. In any case, none of these were ordained apostles. So no one in the First Presidency had a legal claim to the presidency of the church or to the leadership of the church. In fact, Frederick G. Williams, as I mentioned before, passed away in 1842. And we understand from the history that William Law was somewhat complicit in the martyrdom. And so the only one left in the presidency, none of them ordained apostles, was Sidney Rigdon. If we then go to the next three that were ordained, the three witnesses, all three of them had been excommunicated and left the church. So at this time, we have Joseph, Hiram, and Brigham Young. Joseph first, Hiram second, Brigham third. That was the order of ordination as far as seniority in the position of the apostleship. And so, as at the time of the martyrdom, then there was great confusion that was going on in Nauvoo, because the church had never gone through this before. It was totally new experience for them. And so what happened, in fact, Sidney Rigdon now had, in essence, left the main body, had gone back to Pittsburgh and was kind of doing his own thing and established some things there that that he thought was correct, but he was not really in line or associated closely with the church at the time. When he heard about the martyrdom, and generally Sidney was recognized as this very eloquent, precise, wonderful orator, absolutely knew how to give a good talk. So Sidney hears of the martyrdom. He decides now, and he comes back, and there's a lot going on. We'll talk more in detail when we talk about the martyrdom later this year. But just so we understand what's going on here, this is now in August of 1844. Sidney arrives first, around the 3rd or 4th of August, and starts talking with people there. William Marks, who was the stake president of Nauvoo, the Smith family, and whatever. And Sidney begins to put forth this claim and say, I now am here. The object of my mission is to visit the saints and offer myself to them as a guardian. So Sidney came, and he's not trying to say he wants to be president. In fact, he kind of hinted that Joseph's son, Joseph Smith III, was the legal heir if it were a church or an organization of Joseph Smith, and perhaps so. But Sidney said, Joseph III is too young, so I'm going to be here as the guardian and trustee and trust until we can now be in a position to transition that leadership to Joseph's son, who is the rightful heir. That was the position of Sidney Rigdon. So he came and was there in advance of the Quorum of the 12. The only two apostles there were Willard Richards and John Taylor, who happened to be in Carthage with Joseph and Hiram when Joseph and Hiram were martyred. So, again, I don't have a lot of time to talk about the martyrdom, but just one thing to understand is that at the time of that event in Carthage jail, Hiram was killed first. Hiram fell first. So that was the second in seniority. He died first. And then Joseph first in seniority. So both Joseph and Hiram. And as we talk about the martyrdom, we begin to understand the law of witnesses. It was necessary for two witnesses to be involved to testify with their blood to the reality of the work. And that was Joseph and Hiram, which left now Brigham as the legal successor, as the legally ordained senior apostle. I want to read here a statement from Brigham Young before we go on. This is taken from the Times and Seasons on October the 15th of 1844, just a few months after all of this occurred in Nauvoo. Here, Brigham never had any keen desire to be the president or to lead the church, but he understood and recognized his position because he had been taught that by Joseph. Here, Brigham says, if Hiram had lived, he would not have stood between Joseph and the 12, but he would have stood for Joseph. Did Joseph ordain any man to take his place? He did. Who was it? It was Hiram. But Hiram fell a martyr before Joseph. If Hiram had lived, he would have acted for Joseph. So Brigham had some understanding of this principle of seniority. He knew that Hiram preceded Brigham as far as seniority as an ordained apostle. I also want to read from a passage here from a biography of Brigham Young. Biography of Brigham Young by Leonard J. Arrington. So, with the martyrdom and the passing of the prophet, great confusion in Nauvoo. The saints were wondering, what do I do now? Sidney Rigdon shows up, and in fact he met with some of the apostles as they began to come in, and he basically said, brethren, you're lost. You're like without a leader. You're confused. I'm here to help bring order into the church. So here is Brigham. Brigham was with Orson Pratt in Peterborough, New Hampshire. The members of the quorum had all been sent off on missions, and certainly divine intervention. They had been sent off on missions. They were not in Nauvoo at the time of the martyrdom, and likely if they had been there, there may have been some of them that had been taken prisoner as well. But here, still in the Boston area, I'm reading from this book, Brigham Young, American Moses by Leonard J. Arrington. Brigham began to hear rumors of the assassination for the first time on the 9th of July. So this is a week, 10 days after the martyrdom. 1 week later, which would have been mid-July, he and Orson Pratt were at the home of a brother Bemet in Peterborough, New Hampshire, where they heard a letter read from a Nauvoo resident giving particulars of the murder. The first thing I thought, Brigham said in his journal, was whether Joseph had taken the keys of the kingdom with him from the earth. Brother Orson Pratt sat on my left. We were both leaning back on our chairs. Bringing my hand down on my knee, I said, the keys of the kingdom are right here with the church. So Brigham understood what was occurring and the position he held as the president of the Quorum of the 12. In essence, that established him as soon as Joseph was dead, because Hiram had died first. As soon as Joseph was dead, that established Brigham as the president of the church by his position as president of the Quorum of the 12. Now, as we showed on the board, that's why the Lord established and set it up this way, because the Quorum of the 12, acting as a quorum, is equal in power and authority to the Quorum of the First Presidency. At the passing of the president, the Quorum of the First Presidency is dissolved. In the case of Joseph, none of those men were apostles in any case. Brigham was the third in seniority as far as the apostleship just prior to the martyrdom. Here now, as recorded in the history of the church, as we can see there, this is Brigham's statement as he's talking to the assembled members in Nauvoo. Joseph conferred upon our heads all the keys and powers belonging to the apostleship, which he himself held before he was taken away. So again, keys, powers belonging to the apostleship. We see the establishment, seniority. No man or set of men can get between Joseph and the 12 in this world or in the world to come. How often has Joseph said to the 12, I have laid the foundation and you must build thereon. For upon your shoulders the kingdom rests. So Joseph taught this to the 12. He had conferred all the necessary keys, powers, and obligations upon the 12. Brigham, as president of that quorum, now was by right, by his ordination as the third senior apostle at the time of the martyrdom, by right, he was in essence the president of the church. In fact, the Quorum of the 12 managed the affairs of the church from that June of 1844 until the end of December in 1847. 3.5 years, there was no First Presidency. The Quorum of the 12 functioned, managed, led the migration from Nauvoo to the west. Brigham at the head, great, powerful prophet, Brigham Young. It wasn't until December of 1847 that now, as the president, Brigham felt impressed it was time to reorganize the First Presidency. And I think in part to kind of give the church a little bit of time to get over the martyrdom and the fact and to understand Brigham was the prophet by right. By every right, he was the prophet. So the First Presidency was reorganized in December of 1847 because that quorum, as we showed before, had all the rights and the privileges. Now, this idea, this concept of having the seating in the quorum by age had not really gone away in its entirety. We see in section 124, January of 1841, the Lord was very specific. He said, Brigham, you're the man. You're the senior apostle. As it turned out, he was senior by time of ordination. So he had that right. So I think there, and as we read through the members of the quorum, the Lord is essentially going through and establishing them in the order of ordination. Now, for some reason, not sure why, tradition, whatever might occur, that did not necessarily hold fast up until the time of Brigham Young. So here's a picture of Brigham Young. This would be in the mid-1850s, sometime prior to 1857. This is Brigham Young now, and the First Presidency, we see Heber C. Kimball on his right as first counselor, Willard Richards on his left as the second counselor. And now we can see, it's kind of small print, but we can see there, I don't want to talk about 5 of these individuals, or 4 of these individuals. If we talk about the ordination, here now, John Taylor, seating here in 1850s, sitting as the 5th member. However, his ordination was the 19th of December in 1838. We then see Wilford Woodruff, 26th of April, 1839. He's seated here as 4th in the quorum. Orson Hyde, 27th of June, 1839. And then Orson Pratt, 20th of January, 1843. Now I need to clarify here with Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt. They had been previously ordained and established in the quorum as apostles. However, for a short period of time, both Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt fell out of favor with the church. They, in essence, gave up their position in the quorum, and sometime later, shortly after, in fact, Orson Hyde was about within a month, came back. However, now it was necessary to have him reestablished in the quorum. So his seniority now would have been junior to both Wilford Woodruff and John Taylor. Orson Pratt, same sort of situation. He fell out of favor in 1841. Middle of 1841, came back later, as I recall, 1842 or so. So he had been out, had to be reestablished. So he now was in a junior position, if we call it that, which it would be, to Orson Hyde. The seating that we see here in 1850 was held in effect for 25 years or so, up until 1875. At that time, George Albert Smith, who had been now brought into the presidency, into the First Presidency as a counselor to Brigham Young, began to think about this question of seniority. And he, in fact, began to talk to John Taylor and said, John, you actually are senior by time of ordination, as we see right there. John Taylor, being a very kind man, said, "What? I'm not really seeking for office, but I understand we need to resolve this question of seniority. Who is the senior apostle? Because there is the question of age, which again, many kind of referred back to what happened in 1835, 20 years earlier, as well as the reordination, the reestablishment of Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt. And so this is a question that was kind of in their minds, in the mind of George Albert Smith. John Taylor had the same sort of question, but he never brought it up. I mean, he wasn't going to bring that up to Brigham. I'm now reading from the Comprehensive History of the Church by B.H. Roberts, page 520, volume 7. Elder Wilford Woodruff, for some years, was also regarded as outranking Elder Taylor in the Quorum of the 12, owing to the fact that Elder Woodruff was the older man. So here this principle, this concept of age had come into play as well. This idea that seniority of age determined the rank of standing is in the quorum, obtained doubtless for the reason that when the quorum was first organized in February 1835, members took their place in order of age. So there was that. There was the issue with Elders Hyde. I read further, the relationship of John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff in the Council of the 12, as well as the relation of Elders Hyde and Pratt to John Taylor, were settled some years before the death of President Brigham Young. So here now, recorded in a history by John Taylor. John Taylor again indicated that George Albert Smith, who was a member of the First Presidency, came and talked to John Taylor and said, I'm not comfortable because I think the seniority question is not settled yet. And then John Taylor records, sometime after this, in June of 1875, President Young brought up the subject of seniority and stated, so this is President Young, Brigham Young, without prompting from George Albert Smith or prompting from John Taylor. President Young, obviously he was impressed under the influence of the Spirit. President Young brought up the subject of seniority and stated that John Taylor was the man that stood next to him, and that when he was not, Brigham Young, was not, John Taylor presided. He also made the statement that Brother Hyde and Brother Pratt were not in their right positions in this quorum. Upon this statement, I assumed the position indicated. So Brigham in 1875 reestablished the seniority in the quorum. So in 1875, and by that time, in 1875, we understand, or we know from history, that Parley P. Pratt, who now was second in 1850, second in seating in the quorum, Parley P. Pratt had been assassinated, been murdered, as I recall, someone in 1857. So in June of 1875, when Brigham now received this personal revelation and made the statement, the seating in the quorum in those first four positions was realigned, as it should have been by date of ordination, as you see in the above placard there, meaning that John Taylor now, senior and president of the quorum, Wilford Woodruff next, Orson Hyde next, and Orson Pratt as fourth. So the seniority was reestablished by Brigham Young under inspiration to follow the precedent of seniority in the quorum. And so that was 2 years before Brigham passed away. When Brigham died in 1877, John Taylor, by right, again, assumed the position as president of the quorum. He was president of the quorum, and he assumed the position then as president of the church. Again, in this case, for many different reasons, there was a lot going on. We don't have time to talk about that. For a little over 3 years, Quorum of the 12 was the presiding quorum in the church. When John Taylor passed away some 10 years later, then Wilford Woodruff, who now was next in seniority, became president, was president of the quorum. When President Taylor, president of the church, died, then Wilford Woodruff assumed his position as president of the church. At that time, it was about a little over 2 years before the First Presidency was organized. Since that time, this question of seniority has pretty much been settled. But I see the beauty of this and the history that we just discussed here this evening, where the Lord established this process, this precedent, this organization. Now, Josh, I'm going to go back to the board. back to the camera, where because, as we saw in 1841, section 107, by the establishment of these two quorums, the quorum of the First Presidency, the quorum of the 12, equal in power and authority. Whenever the president of the church passes away, and generally these counselors are members of the quorum, they will then take their respective position in seniority in the quorum of the 12, which means it could be 14 in the quorum of the 12, which is fine. The name of the quorum is 12, but there could be 14, whatever the case might be, members in that quorum now. And the quorum of the 12 now is the presiding quorum of the church. I want to read just one statement in closing here, because I think this illustrates this principle that now, over time, as things have gone on, that the members of the First Presidency, well, in fact, all the apostles understand this. They understand how this works. In 1974, President Tanner of the First Presidency described the transition of authority and the procedure in which a new president of the church is sustained by the quorum of the 12. And he recounts this in relation to the passing of President Harold B. Lee. So I quote here from President Tanner. It is significant to note, I'm reading what he says, it is significant to note just what took place at the time of the passing of President Harold B. Lee. President Romney, who was second counselor to President Lee, had been called to the hospital as they talked. President Lee, realizing that he might be incapacitated for some time, said to President Romney, President Tanner is away, and I want you, President Romney, in place of President Tanner, to take over and carry on the affairs of the church. President Kimball, now Spencer Kimball, was president of the quorum, next in seniority by ordination to President Lee. President Kimball, who came in later, offered his services to President Romney. However, immediately upon the announcement of President Lee's passing, President Romney turned to President Kimball and said, you, as president of the Quorum of the 12, are now in charge. I'm at your disposal and I'm prepared to do anything I can to help. What a beautiful establishment of church governments. What that means, now think about this for a moment. What does that mean? That means that never at any time, even at the time of the martyrdom, never at any time is the church without, as far as the Lord's concerned, the church is never without a designated leader, meaning a designated president of this church organization. It took some time, particularly at the time of the martyrdom, and we'll talk more about that later this year. It took some time for the church to come to that understanding and to recognize that. But there are several things that happened in that August conference between Brigham and Sidney that testified to the body of the church that Brigham Young was the man that the Lord had selected. And as we see that, if we go all the way back to the establishment of the Church of Jesus Christ, who was the senior apostle? We've talked this before. Peter, who came to restore the authority to Joseph Smith. Peter, who was designated as the first apostle, Joseph Smith. Second apostle, Oliver Cowdery, that blessing given to Hiram Smith. Third apostle, as we talked here this evening, either by age or by time of ordination with that original seating. Who was it? And then reaffirmed in the Revelation in section 124 in 1841. Who was the third senior apostle? Brigham Young. 2 years before Brigham Young passed away, he realigned the quorum in the presence of seniority, and that is exactly the way that it occurs today, each and every time without question, because the Lord has established it that way. There's no question. In fact, President Hinckley gave a beautiful talk at one time, and he said, this is such a beautiful, clear, clean process because there's no campaigning, there's no election, there's no discussion. Everyone who is in that position in the quorum understands how it works. They understand that president of the Quorum of the 12 is, in fact, the president of the church. It is his absolute right to reestablish the First Presidency when he deems it appropriate. Generally now, it's within a week or two. There's not these long periods, although the Quorum of the 12 could function for as long as necessary. I just want to close this evening and bear my testimony of how grateful I am that now this is one other fact within the church that establishes the reality of the restoration. this organization we see, which we don't see anywhere else throughout religious organizations. We do not see this type of an organization where that transition is smooth. There's no question. It occurs without debate, without election, without consideration. Everyone knows from one moment and from one heartbeat to the next. The church is never without a head. The church is never without a designated leader. And as we see that, we understand that these men, they're not chosen by any process in mortality. These individuals are appointed, called, and assigned to that position by Jesus Christ, whose church this is. And I leave that testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.